Hi, really well beings. Dr. Bartier here with a video all about getting your dose set, which is sort of a second part to the feeling well videos that I've been doing. It actually looks more detail at some of the hormones that dictate how we're feeling and how they work together in a symphony. And knowing me, I like to think about things quite simply in terms of quartets. And so I'm going to just talk to you about the principal 4 hormones that I think about, but then introduce a couple more. My general approach to feelings are that feeling like life is wonderful is not always about feeling that life is pleasant. To be human, we need to have a full spectrum of emotions. And when emotions get stuck in some way, then that's when they cause injury and they're not so healthy. And often, sometimes we can withdraw away from feelings, and so they get a little bit blocked. And this analogy is a little unpleasant, but I'm going to describe it anyway, because it helps, and children understand it as well as adults, and that is that these feelings need to flow through us and nurture us and guide us, a bit like poos. And that if they don't come out, then they build up inside us, and then they get quite uncomfortable, they limit us, they use a lot of energy, and also they can come out messy when you don't expect them to. They can also be painful when they come out too. But the good news is, as a 5-year-old once told me, Dr. Bartier, you know what? I feel like I'm getting good at flowing with these, and I quite enjoy sitting on the toilet and feeling these feelings flowing. And then you can harness them if you need to. So enough of the poo analogies. We'll just come on to the actual terminology that we're going to go into. So those 4 hormones that I was going to look at are called dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And that's the dose. Dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And they dictate our emotional states. And so when our emotional states aren't quite right and we're spiraling into anxiety or depression and get stuck, often there's some kind of feedback that's telling us that those hormones aren't quite in balance. Which I actually see not as a problem. They're an opportunity to see that our life isn't quite in balance. And I try and understand what it is. So if someone, for example, in my GP work comes to see me with depression, I actually look through what their dose is and try and understand why it's here. So rather than just treating the depression as the end all, it's actually understanding, so why does it come? And seeing the depression as potentially an opportunity to understand a little bit more about what's going on. So rather than covering up the engine warning light, actually saying, no, that's our engine warning light, we're going to work with it and find out what the issue is. And then by addressing that, a whole cascade of issues get solved, rather than just covering it up so it then manifests in some other way a little bit further down the line. So dopamine, what do you know about dopamine? So its hormone exists in the body, particularly a neurotransmitter in certain parts of the brain. It's really important in many aspects of our operating. But I tend to think of dopamine as the hormone that, or neurotransmitter rather, that sets our thresholds for pleasure. So that sense of anticipation, and you get a pleasure from anticipation. So something you're looking forward to. So it's like the anticipation you get before you have a first lick of an ice cream. That's to do with dopamine release. And so if you're enjoying the anticipation of something, you actually get quite pleased and excited. It's quite energizing before you've actually done whatever that thing is. So I think of it as setting my thresholds for excitement. And typically someone who's low in dopamine would be someone who has a higher threshold for pleasure or pain. You know, they have a higher threshold for sensation. So teens, for example, or adolescents, their dopamine responsivity changes. So it takes a lot to get a teen out of bed or to get interested, and they need a bigger hit. They need more stimulation to be interested in something. So they're kind of attitude is actually physiologically a change, and it means that they have to leave the house, they have to get something bigger, and they get frustrated with their status quo. So it's all part of being, going through your adolescence. And similarly, we all have these things, and they're kind of mean we don't get pleasure with the normal things. We've got to get a bit more of a kick. So it's a kind of, it gives us a bit of a hump to get over. And the key thing that actually our source for dopamine is actually it gets replenished when we rest. So it we have a surge in dopamine release when we meet something that's challenging, that challenges us. And it's particularly if our life's on the line or something we really value is on the line. And then if we are meeting that challenge and then step away into a peaceful state, so we're not necessarily running on adrenaline, and then the second wave we get is to do with dopamine, and it triggers different parts of our brain to work really effectively. So high performance athletes and high performance mental elites, if I can use that term, actually harness that, and they call that flow states. But the key thing is you need to replenish it by rest, by either lying semi-supine for a few minutes in the day, and by getting a good night's sleep, because that's how the dopamine gets repleted. The next one is oxytocin, which you may have heard of as something gets released when we're breastfed, and when women breastfeed. And it's often thought of as the love hormone, and it's often associated with touch and a sense of connection, and a sense of affection. So I think of it as the kind of tribal hormone that you feel safe and connected. And interestingly, it doesn't come if you're not touched so readily as if you're touched. So even just giving yourself a little wipe can actually help release it. But actually just connecting with someone over social media, unless you get that kind of emotional surge that comes with it, it doesn't actually meet our needs. So though we can have 101 friends, if we're not actually connecting with someone at that deeper level, we won't get that oxytocin release. And so people who feel replete in it don't get that sense of empathy. And just to go on a small tangent, so I had a challenge where where I work as a GP, I had to sign lots of prescriptions for people in a massive practice where I didn't actually know who these people were. And I'm usually motivated by love. That's my key thing. So I had to harness some sense of touch when I was holding the prescription, that I was connecting with the person and connecting with something that's going to touch that person's life, and felt the love while I was doing it. Then getting my sense of oxytocin and that sense of connectivity, which is really important to feel happy and safe. The next part is serotonin. And you may be aware of medications called SSRIs, which are antidepressant drugs, they're also named as, and they block the breakdown of serotonin, so it increases the amount of it. And so I think of serotonin as being the source of our emotional energy. So they don't necessarily make us happy, but they give that little burst of energy emotionally, so that any small fluctuations aren't so catastrophic. So we all have fluctuations in our emotional energy, and if we're running low, that can seem quite a lot. Whereas, I'll come closer to you, if we're running low, those small movements can feel quite a lot. Whereas if we have a reasonable amount in our banks, that small movement doesn't seem quite so big after all. And interestingly, a big source of that is our gut. And so getting healthy foods that nurture and most of our nerve function is in our gut as well, so that nurture our microbiome, then boosts our natural serotonin production. So by looking after your gut and your gut health, and also impacts on our serotonin levels. And then the other one's endorphins. So endorphins are, you're probably aware of those as kind of when you exercise and you get excited, they get released. So their body's natural painkiller, and they work on the same receptors as morphine. And so I tend to think of them as being, their function is about enjoyable expression, also pain relief. So if we're having to fight and work hard, then we get the endorphins to get us through it too. And so exercise, singing, pain can also be associated with releasing it. If pain is associated with meaning, if it's meaningless pain, then we don't release it, and which is awful. Whereas if we have pain that has meaning, for example, childbirth, then the endorphins are released. And childbirth, which is, a pretty physically challenging event, can be managed without needing necessarily many additional drugs. So my wife didn't, I won't talk about that, another story. So that's those. And so we get it from perfect examples of exercise and singing. So when you think about those, that dose and getting them, it's really easy to get them from sleeping well and resting. Really easy from feeling connected. Whether you touch a dog or get stroked or massage yourself, but that sense of intimacy. You can get it from eating well, eating wholesome, and you can get it from exercise or activity or expression. So just getting out there and doing a Julie Andrews will actually tick most of those boxes, because of Julie Andrews, that movement where you express in the morning gives you a bit of daylight that helps you sleep well. It gives you a sense of connectivity with nature, and it fills up your lungs, which feels good. It also helps your gut health work better because it sets your circadian rhythms, and it gives you a sort of outside exercise expression time. And I mentioned, if you don't get it, you can get it from external sources. But so dopamine, a lot of people rely on things that kind of bypass or give them that sense of anticipation. So they need drugs that give a bigger hit. So if your dopamine system is messed up somehow, you can then be dependent on other recreational drugs to give you that hit, or even things like caffeine and sugar. If you aren't getting a sense of safety and connection, then you can then try and get it from other sources. So comfort foods can try and do it. So milky, chocolate, those kind of comfort foods that remind you of breast milk can get it. And again, that can then be quite addictive. If you're not getting a sense of the serotonin, you can then crave it from more and more challenging sources. So you can try and stimulate your gut again with provocative foods. But the thing is, it doesn't actually help us. We can also, try and turn to things that, so those SSRI drugs that can be really effective. But interestingly, those SSRI drugs actually mess up your sleep. The quality of your deep sleep isn't so good. So they come at a price. And the endorphins, again, you can try and get them again from drugs. You can try and get them from other sources, which unfortunately aren't sustainable. So those are all the kind of the common ones we talk about. And then the set part of DOSET is actually looking at the fact that as humans, we require challenge. And most people don't actually recognise that challenge is good and necessary for us to be human, but it's the right sort of challenge. So I think of the set as being the steroids, the epinephrine, which is another word for adrenaline, and testosterone. Which, interestingly, men and women need testosterone to be healthy. So we actually require, those things to keep our baseline going well. And then we need a challenge to then extend our baseline. We require those things. So the thing is, when these things are out of balance, so if we have a challenge that's going on, we produce a hormone called a steroid, which actually says, I'm under stressed state. I'm going to harness my resources and bring them out so they're there and available to use. So it's like your quartermaster gets all your things ready for action. But if you are in a state of chronic stress, so chronic stress is not so good, because then you're using up all those reserves and you're borrowing from Peter. You have to pay back Peter eventually, but your immune system gets hit, your hormonal systems get hit too. Epinephrine is the adrenaline, so that's like the turbo boost button. Okay, I'm full fight or flight. So adrenaline is that thing that really gets your heart rate pumping and gets your body ready for action. Again, we need that surge of release, but too much chronic stress and too much adrenaline, not so good. And then the other one is testosterone, which is I think of that as the hormone of triumph. So it's when you set yourself a challenge and you're rising to that challenge. And so, interestingly, our testosterone is dictated by multiple factors, but the most significant one that I've discovered is actually how our poise. So the way we hold our body influences, when we're under stress, whether or not we release testosterone. So if you have that kind of coward state, it means you're thinking there's someone more dominant than me and I need to keep my head down. And so your testosterone stays down so you don't get into a fight with a bigger dog than you that can kill you. However, if you feel continually suppressed and your testosterone goes down, then these stress hormones have no counterbalance, and therefore we get into a kind of an internal chronic stress state. However, if you can have opportunities where you can come out of that habit and stand tall, then those are the things. So if you can expand your chest and stand tall, it actually changes the release of our testosterone. So doing that Julie Andrews movement where you put your arms up, stand tall and go, yes! At least once a day, it actually increases the testosterone and reduces those stress hormones. So just once a day, getting your Julie Andrews will actually make a massive difference to all of you getting a dose. And it's just timing it with the right time of day will be really good. And that way, when you do it, you don't actually turn to the other habits which aren't very helpful. And I call those addictions. So we all need comfort sometimes, but if you need comfort every day, it's telling me there's an issue underlying it. And so an addiction is a habit that doesn't really help. And that's not helping long term. Though it helps short term, give you comfort, it's not helping you long term. So if you need it every day, there's an issue. And those addictions aren't necessary if you get your dose set right. And so that's my little introduction to some of the hormones associated with feeling well and getting your dose set right. And just bearing in mind, we all have fluctuations. That's part of being human. That's natural. And that you've got plenty of good internal sources. And if you rely on those, that's great. If you're relying on external sources, you're not necessarily going to address the lack that feeling is pointing towards, so that you can then meet that need at its source. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you find that useful. If there's anything to take home from this, it is, if the feelings are there, take notice. They have a place, and they're telling you something. And they're probably reminding you to eat well, to sleep well, to connect well and feel loved, to eat well and to move your body a little bit and have a point of triumph. Stand tall and know that you're doing your best. Lots of love. Bye for now.